This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Harper. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Look for the big button that says Patreon, click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. My guest today is an American journalist specializing in the Middle East and formerly based in Jordan. He has written for Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and other publications, and now has a new book out titled The Most American King, Abdullah of Jordan. Was just published by Universal Publishers. Aaron Magid, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, King Abdullah succeeded his father, King Hussein, more than a quarter of a century ago. His time on the throne was no less tumultuous than his father's, but just like him, he has managed to navigate the ship quite safely despite all the difficulties, those that are characteristic of the Middle East and those that are specific to the Kingdom of Jordan. To what extent would you say that Abdullah's reign is a continuation of his father's?
It's a great question. I would say that King Abdullah has adopted some similar policies to his father, particularly on the Palestinian issue. They've both been strong supporters of the Palestinian cause and the Jordanian custodianship and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I would say a difference between the two leaders has been their willingness for usage of force in military actions. King Hussein was willing to enter the 1967 war against Israel, which caused him to lose the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And then a few years later, he had a civil war in 1970 that had clashes with the Syrian military as well. King Abdullah has been very cautious about his usage of force, and he hasn't sent Jordanian forces into a single large ground campaign during his entire rule. And I think that's one of the key reasons why he's stayed in power for so long.
Mm-hmm. But those two things that you just said about support for the Palestinians and the usage of force can be contradictory in some ways, because if we look at Hussein's military campaigns that were essentially against Israel, therefore could be interpreted as for the Palestinians. I mean, that can also be debated, but that was really the rationale behind it. And Abdullah was refraining from using force. So in what way did he pursue the Palestinian cause? In what way did he remain committed to it other than just, lip service?
Well, I would say that King Abdullah's main support for the Palestinian cause has been from a diplomatic angle. There's certainly been some humanitarian support, and we saw that during the Gaza war, where King Abdullah himself actually participated in an airdrop of food and other humanitarian supplies for Gaza. But he has argued that it's not in Jordan's national interest to pursue a military campaign against Israel. And actually, over a decade before President Trump used the term American First, King Abdullah in the early 2000s adopted a Jordan First slogan. And this was during the heat of the Second Intifada. There were many Jordanians who were calling for the cancellation of the 1994 peace treaty and perhaps a military campaign against Israel. King Abdullah says, no, that's not in our country's national interest. Just as Jordan lost a significant amount of territory in 1967, the assumption would be if they were to launch a frontal military campaign against Israel, it would be a similar defeat. So he refused to participate in such an endeavor. Another example of the Jordan First policy was many Jordanians were frustrated with the U.S. invasion of Iraq that was looming in 2002, 2003, and called for a significant change in Jordanian U.S. policy. King Abdullah did not adopt that approach. He had a different stance than his father during the Gulf War, and he, even though he didn't support the U.S. invasion, he allowed for U.S. troops to be stationed in the country, for Amman to be a logistics hub for the U.S. military post the 2003 invasion, and worked quite well with the Bush administration. That caused U.S. aid to Jordan to increase, not decrease, which was different from what happened in 1991 with the Gulf War. So King Abdullah, he wants to be more practical, and he's willing to support the Palestinian cause, willing to criticize the Israeli government, but he's not willing to engage in military operations against Israel because he would think it's futile.
Yeah, but also in a way, his father had a change of heart at some point. I mean, we're talking about 67 and 73. He actually didn't join the 73 war.
Correct, he was not in the
so
73 war.
67, and he reigned until his death in 1999. And of course, I mean, there was the whole peace process with the PLO, between Israel and the PLO, that he sponsored wholeheartedly. And as you said, the 1994 peace agreement with Israel, that in many ways was ushered in by that change of heart vis-a-vis the Palestinians and Israel. So yeah, going back to my question about the continuity, you would say that this is the Jordan First policy is not something that he himself invented. In many ways, you could see it as having adopted it from his father.
But I would argue that his father more adopted pan-Arab causes. So we saw that in the 1967 war, which he joined because of pressure from Egypt and Syria. And that, at the end of the day, probably hurt the Jordanian cause because it caused them to lose a significant amount of territory. And then once again, during the 1991 Gulf War, which King Hussein was a strong critic of the U.S. action because he supported Saddam Hussein and he was a proponent of pan-Arab nationalism. And that caused Jordan to lose a considerable amount of support from the United States. And only when Jordan entered the peace process within the 1994 peace treaty with Israel in 1994 did it bring back a lot of support from Washington. So King Abdullah is more focused generally on Jordanian national interests, less on the Arab world as a whole. King Hussein was more willing to adopt pan-Arab causes.
And does this have to do with his being the most American? I mean, his biography is that his mother was British and much of his upbringing took place in the United States. In many ways, English is his go-to language. His sort of westernized, I mean, fault of a better word. Is this what you mean by the most American, or is it something that is cultural, or is it something that is political?
So I would say it's both his personal ties to the United States and political. So from a personal perspective, he spent middle school and high school in the United States. He went to Deerfield Academy in Massachusetts. He so much wanted to fit in with the other guys, he went by Ab, not Abdullah. In fact, when his father wanted him to have Arabic lessons, he would hide in the closet. Because he just wanted a typical American experience. He was on the wrestling team there. And then even after Deerfield Academy, he went to Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And he so much enjoyed that experience, he sent his own child, the Crown Prince Hussein, to the prestigious Jesuit school. Later, he trained with the U.S. military in Kentucky. He went on his honeymoon, not in Paris or London, but in Hawaii. Just shows his connection to the United States. Later, he was even on a Star Trek episode. And when he became king in 1999, he spoke far better English than Arabic. And later, after he became ruler, he continued to own property in the United States, both in California and the D.C. area. So his personal connections with the United States are quite strong, and there's no other Arab leader who has such significant ties with the United States, which is the reason why I chose this title. But it's not just personal, it's also political. So King Abdullah is the first Arab leader to meet in the White House with both President Biden, President Trump, and President Obama on a bipartisan basis. Thousands of U.S. troops are stationed in Jordan under King Abdullah's rule, under both Democratic and Republican administrations. He was the first Arab leader to have a joint address before Congress. Jordan was the first Arab country to have a free trade agreement with the United States during the Bush administration. And then most importantly, from the Jordanian government's perspective, Jordan receives about $1.5 billion in annual aid, which is a huge amount and critically important for a poor country like Jordan. So some people argue that there are other Arab countries that have strong ties with the United States right now, and that's true, whether Saudi Arabia or Qatar. But what makes Jordan unique is how bipartisan the relationship is across many years. So, for example, Saudi Arabia, yes, the Trump administration has strong ties with them now, but if we remember in the previous administration under Democrats, because of the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post columnist, that caused a significant rift with Democrats, and Joe Biden even called Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, a pariah figure. Qatar, yes, they do have good ties right now, but in 2017, during the first Trump administration, President Trump called for a blockade against Qatar because he accused them of supporting terrorism. So only King Abdullah has been able to maintain a very strong relationship both with Democrats and Republicans, and that served his country quite well, and that's one of the reasons why they've received billions of dollars.
Do you think that his being American, being so steeped in American culture and political culture, has impacted the political culture in Jordan to some degree? Has he imported any American principles or rules to Jordan from the way politics is done in Washington?
So on a rhetorical level, he has supported democracy. You saw an op-ed he wrote in the Wall Street Journal multiple times calling for liberal and political reforms in the country. But on a practical level, the short answer is no. Jordan remains an authoritarian country. Parliament is toothless. The king personally is the one who is appointing or dismissing the prime ministers. And at the end of the day, him and the mukhabarat, the intelligence services, and the military are the ones who are running the country. The prime minister is a relatively weak figure. So even though he's very familiar with democracy, at the end of the day, he's most concerned about maintaining power for himself, which is quite consistent with other leaders in the Middle East. And the focus right now is ensuring that his son, the Crown Prince Hussein, is able to transition and inherit all this power when the transition eventually happens.
Yeah. Has he been pushed back on it by, people in Jordan, by his American interlocutors about the fact that it still remains, a tyrannical Middle Eastern country, almost just like any other?
Well, I would say, first of all, it's not as bad as other Arab regimes. So, for example, under Saddam Hussein, the torture was far worse, certainly compared to Jordan's northern neighbor, Bashar al-Assad. King Abdullah is not nearly as ruthless as any of those regimes. He's not bombing his people. He's not killing journalists. So it's certainly better than many other Arab countries, but it's not a democracy at all. I would say during the Arab Spring protests, there was some calls by the Obama administration to adopt more political reforms. There was concern when President Biden came to power that there would be a shift away from just a realpolitik relationship, but more towards liberal democracy as a part of the bilateral relationship. But that never really was implemented. And at the end of the day, from the United States perspective, security and political issues always become more important for the bilateral relationship than democracy in Jordan. And currently right now, there is no significant U.S. pressure for Jordan to democratize. In fact, there hasn't been a single public comment from the Trump administration on human rights or democracy.
Yeah, and neither from the royal family either. I mean, did he ever entertain thoughts about British type constitutional monarchy or some sort of limited democracy under his rule? Was there any thought experiments in that direction? Given his great knowledge and familiarity with Western political traditions.
So on a rhetorical level, yes. He said in 2013 in an interview with Atlantic magazine that he wanted Jordan to transition to a UK-style democracy, but that was never implemented. During the Arab Spring protests, he called for Jordan to change from the king appointing the prime minister to parliament, but this was, again, never implemented. So he has said, or he has promised, that he wants to move Jordan towards a more UK-style or Western-style democracy, but at the end of the day, the evidence shows that he wants to keep power mainly for himself and the security forces. I would say the one example that we have of him adopting more Western approaches is on the economic sphere. So King Hussein had more of a socialist style of running the country. The public sector controlled very large companies. When King Abdullah came to power in 1999, backed by the IMF, he adopted more neoliberal approaches. And we saw the private sector strengthen. We saw some of these large companies move from the public sector to the private sector, and they actually led to significant success in lowering unemployment. So when King Abdullah came to power, unemployment was about 25%. In 2007, 2008, before the Great Recession, it was about 12 to 13%. So he did have success in that sphere. Unfortunately, Jordan really got hit off its track in 2008, and unemployment continued to go up and up and up. Right now, it's in about 21, 22%, so it's a really terrible situation. Just for perspective for American listeners, during the Great Depression, we had unemployment at about 25%. So Jordan's at Great Depression levels of unemployment, and it's been going on that for many years right now. So the economy is really terrible. And unfortunately for King Abdullah, even though he adopted some capitalist approaches, it didn't work long-term to lower unemployment.
Mm. How would you say that during the Arab Spring revolutions, Jordan was almost the only country in the Middle East was untouched by it? Was it thanks to Abdullah's leadership, or was just other factors as well?
So I wouldn't say it was untouched. There were significant protests in the country, both in 2011 and 2012. Some of the reasons for the protests were economic, due to the high unemployment, due to the corruption. Some of it also veered into the political lane as well, calling for greater levels of democracy, for parliament to have more power. But at the end of the day, you are correct that it didn't lead to a significant damage on King Abdullah's leadership. Of course, he continued to reign. I would say there are multiple factors that led him to do better than some of his neighbors, whether in Egypt or in Syria. Number one is monarchies in general did much better during the Arab Spring. So if you look at him, if you look at the leader, the king of Morocco, the king of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, none of these leaders fell. So there is some sort of legitimacy in the Arab world towards a monarchy that doesn't exist towards presidencies. The presidencies in general did much worse. I would say also his nuanced use of force did help him. So if we see what happened in Syria, where President Bashar al-Assad was using really ruthless violence against his people, killing hundreds of thousands, using chemical weapons, that really galvanized the opposition. And yes, it didn't lead to the downfall of Assad in 2011, 2012, like other Arab countries, but eventually the opposition was so enraged by his actions that in the past few years, it led to his downfall. King Abdullah, it was certainly not a democracy during the Arab Spring. People were arrested, but he wasn't, killing large numbers of protesters. He wasn't using brutal violence against his people. And I think that did reduce some of the opposition against him. So I would say being a king, on the one hand, helped. Also, his nuanced usage of force and the support of the United States is quite critical. So if we compare it to what happened in Egypt, when President Obama called for Hosni Mubarak's downfall, that played a key role in the military taking over. If President Obama would have had given a similar call in Jordan for King Abdullah to also step down because he's also an authoritarian leader, that could have been extremely damaging for King Abdullah and could have led to his ouster. But King Abdullah had established a very strong relationship with President Obama even before he became president. Actually, during that campaign, when he's still a senator, he visited Jordan to establish quite good ties with King Abdullah. So the role of the United States is critical in maintaining its power.
But also financially, I mean, how critical really is the American support to maintaining the Jordanian economy? And as you said, that is really teetering. It's really in a terrible state.
So the U.S. support is critical, and it's been going on for many years. And it ensures that King Abdullah always knows that if something even worse is going to happen with the economy, he always has the United States to fall back upon. This has been billions upon billions of dollars, one of the highest outside of Israel in the world, goes to Jordan. Not many people in Iowa or Nebraska know about this, but Jordan is really a critical country from U.S. national security perspectives, and therefore Washington continues to invest. If Jordan were to suddenly lose that, it would be quite dire. And actually, that was the fear for the Hashemite Kingdom in last year, in February 2025, because President Trump at the time said that if you don't accept large numbers of Palestinians from Gaza, we might cut off aid. And King Abdullah came to Washington at that point, and it really showed his diplomatic success because he was able to, on the one hand, reject the proposal of the United States to accept large scale numbers of Palestinians, and at the same time continue the support. And actually, this past year, Jordan's aid increased. It shows his understanding of U.S. politics, U.S. culture. He's able to navigate that. And it's interesting because in contrast, during that same month, we also had a visit by a foreign leader who had a lot on the line, which was Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine. And he also disagreed with the U.S. policy. But unlike King Abdullah, Zelensky was thrown out of the White House in a very humiliating fashion. That would never happen to King Abdullah because he understands U.S. culture, he understands U.S. politics, and he knows the right things to say. So in that meeting, he praised President Trump very strongly. He said he's a man of peace, even though this was during the time where the U.S. is providing billions of dollars to Israel in the war in Gaza, and many Jordanians harshly criticized the United States. But he knew that in order to preserve his national interests, he needed to praise the United States in order to continue receiving the generous funds.
Why is Jordan such an asset for Americans, really across the political board?
So number one is the military bases that we have in Jordan. So thousands of U.S. troops are in the country, and we see that during the recent Iran conflict, where Iran has fired hundreds of missiles and drones. An unspecified number of them have hit U.S. military bases. The Jordanian government doesn't like to publicize it, so we don't know. It could be dozens of them have hit U.S. military installations. It could be even larger than that. We saw during the 2024 to 2025, Iran was firing hundreds of missiles and drones at Israel, not just at Jordan. And Jordan allowed not only its military to fight and to shoot the Iranian missiles down, but they allowed Western forces like the United States, like France, to shoot them down. And this was very much appreciated by the Biden administration and by the Trump administration. If you go earlier than that, during the war against ISIS, President Obama in the mid-2010s wanted to avoid a situation that President Bush experienced, where all of the Muslim countries were not participating in the war, and it was viewed as a Western imperialistic effort. So it was very much appreciated by the Obama administration when Jordan participated in the war against ISIS, actively using its air force to bomb targets in Syria and Iraq. It showed to provide more legitimacy to the U.S. campaign. So Washington appreciated it at that point. Then if you go back to the Iraq War, 2003, the United States very much appreciated Jordan providing overflight rights for U.S. military campaign from Jordan into Iraq. Jordan is a neighbor of Iraq. Amman was a logistics hub for the American military, and the Jordanian security forces actually trained the Iraqi military after the 2003 fall of Saddam Hussein. So time and time again, Jordan has stepped up for the United States. I'll give you one more example. During the Syrian refugee crisis, the United States did not want millions of Syrian refugees moving from the Middle East to Europe or the United States. And Jordan generously hosted, according to the United Nations, over 650,000 Syrian refugees. According to the Jordanian government, the number went up to 1.3 million refugees. So the Hashemite Kingdom has been a consistent ally of the United States, even though some of these actions have caused criticism by the Jordanian public.
Yeah, but is it really worth for Abdullah to do the bidding of the Americans at the expense of all the criticism that he gets from home? It's quite a tough balancing act.
Correct. So it's definitely a delicate balancing act, but it's one that King Abdullah has found to be successful. And the proof in the pudding is the fact that he's the longest-serving Arab leader. So he's been in power for over 25 years. And if you look at many of the leaders who were ousted or faced significant violence, it's because they opposed the United States. So right now in Iran, the supreme leader was killed by the United States. If you look at Mubarak in Egypt, he was ousted, I would say in large part because of the U.S. pressure that called for his removal. If you look in Syria, the U.S. sanctions were very significant in leading to Bashar al-Assad's departure. Gaddafi was also removed because of a U.S.-led military campaign. So there's so many examples in the Middle East of being on the wrong side of the United States can really lead to a disaster. And for King Abdullah, because he doesn't have oil, the dependence on the United States is even more important. And even though it's led to some criticism, thankfully, from his perspective, this is not a democracy, so he doesn't have to face the vote of the people, and he continued to rule while receiving the billions of dollars in U.S. aid.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that it has a potential to persist in the same way with Donald Trump on the one hand, with everything that's happening on the Palestinian, between Israel and Palestine, that's also a destabilizing factor? I mean, the good thing about, the amazing thing about Abdullah, and not just Abdullah, I mean, the whole Hashemite dynasty, is really their ability to weather the storm, so many storms around them, and still somehow sail safely. How do you see that the immediate future in that respect?
So I would just look at the immediate past to answer in terms of the immediate future. There were some analysts who I would say incorrectly argued during the Gaza war this was an existential crisis to the kingdom. There were going to be large protests, and it's going to lead to perhaps the downfall of King Abdullah. But I thought that was quite naive of an approach, because King Abdullah has weathered so many storms in the past, whether ISIS, whether Syrian refugee crisis, whether Arab Spring, and he has a strong support from the security forces. So there's no evidence whatsoever that his rule is in imminent danger, even despite the challenges that he faces on the economic front and the lack of oil. I would say long-term, the challenges are most significant from the economic perspective. To give an example of how dire the situation has been, during the Biden administration, you had this phenomenon of Jordanians traveling to Mexico to try to illegally migrate into the United States to find jobs. Of course, during the Trump administration, that's no longer viable. But it just shows how desperate so many young Jordanians are, who are educated at universities, and then they end up being taxi drivers. Mm-hmm. So I would say the economic challenge is the greatest one. But I don't see in the short term any significant evidence that we're going to see the downfall of King Abdullah. It's worth noting that when the transition happens, that's often a sensitive period for monarchies. So when the Crown Prince Hussein eventually becomes King Hussein, that possibly could lead to protests. We also don't really know very much about his policies, the new Crown Prince, because he's given very few interviews, none with the Western media. So in his public statements, he's adopted a very similar approach to his father, but we don't know when he becomes king if he's going to have a different attitude. King Abdullah changed Jordanian approach to from his father very significantly on a few factors. Number one would be his attitude toward Hamas. King Hussein did welcome Hamas in the country. Even after he signed the peace treaty in 1994, King Abdullah, one of his first actions was he kicked out the Hamas leadership from the country. So that would be one example of a difference. Another example would be the approach towards the U.S. invasion of Iraq. King Hussein was strongly opposed. King Abdullah had more of a diplomatic approach, and then the capitalism versus more of a socialist economy as well. So we don't know what the Crown Prince is going to do when he comes into power. We do have evidence that he studied at Georgetown. He speaks English fluently, so he seems to have a strong understanding of U.S. culture and U.S. politics, but he could have a different approach, and that could lead to a different Jordanian policy.
Is Abdullah planning to stand down?
We don't know that he is thinking about leaving power anytime soon. He is at the age of King Hussein when King Hussein passed away. King Hussein did have significant medical issues. We don't really know exactly about King Abdullah's, but it seems to be he's in better health. But King Abdullah, in his 2013 interview, he said he became frustrated with the system and he actually thought about stepping down. This was back in 2009. And he said his family had to say that you can't do that. And for the sake of the country, you need to maintain your rule. Since that interview in 2013, he's never signaled that he wants to leave power again. But he is certainly, in his 60s, and at the time, they're making more and more efforts to place Crown Prince Hussein in the center. He's meeting with both President Biden, President Trump, with Arab leaders. So he's in the center of the conversation. His pictures are all over Jordan. So they definitely want the public to feel more comfortable with Crown Prince Hussein in power. But we don't have any evidence that King Abdullah is going to leave the throne in the next year or 2 years.
What about his relationship with Israel? They've had the peace treaty for more than 30 years now. Again, unlike so many other countries around it, the Jordanian relationship with Israel seems to be stable. Do you still see that as a stable relationship where so many other countries around the world are slowly turning against Israel?
Well, I would say there was a honeymoon phase for King Abdullah and his relationship with Israel during the first year in 1999, early 2000. And since then...
That was a honeymoon period for the entire Middle East with relation to Israel, wasn't it?
True, but I would say specifically for King Abdullah, and I'll give you some examples. Number one would be kicking out of Hamas leadership. The Israeli government very much appreciated that. You had him saying in an interview that he has friends in the Israeli military, comments that you don't think a Jordanian leader would repeat anytime today. So there were many comments like that that were favorable towards Israel. He even said that Israel had the moral high ground when they withdrew from Lebanon in 2000. It would be nearly impossible to even imagine a Jordanian government praising the morals or ethics of the Israeli government today. So it's certainly very different than it was in 1999 and 2000. After the Second Intifada broke out, we saw Jordan withdraw its ambassador from Tel Aviv, and that ambassador didn't return for almost 5 years. So we had a cooling of the relationship in that period, and King Abdullah continued to criticize Israel much more intensely during the Second Intifada. And then when Netanyahu came to power in 2009, we saw a series of incidents that led to a significant amount of tensions between the two countries. I would say that the relations have dropped even further during the Gaza war. We saw Jordan once again recall its ambassador, and it's been 2.5 years since a Jordanian ambassador has been in Tel Aviv, and it told the Israeli ambassador Amman not to return. It's been 2.5 years since that's happened as well. Israel had a water for energy agreement with Jordan and the UAE that was signed during the previous government with Naftali Bennett. But from the Jordanian government's perspective, they froze it in November 2023 because they were protesting Israel's actions in Gaza. And then if you look during South Africa's war crimes case, Jordan actively supported it. And from King Abdullah's perspective, he even accused Israel of committing genocide in Gaza. So there's been a lot of rhetorical criticism and diplomatic acts against Israel, but at the same time, he's refused calls from protesters to cancel the 1994 peace treaty. He's rejected demands to cancel a very important gas accord that the two countries have, about $15 billion that was signed approximately 10 years ago. And then, most importantly, from a security perspective, Jordan's military was shooting down missiles and drones that saved dozens or hundreds of Israeli lives in 2024, 2025, in this most recent year. We had a report from Axios that said Jordanian security forces were mediating between Israel and the new authorities in Syria when Bashar al-Assad was toppled because Jordan had strong security ties with both countries. So on the one hand, there is a decline in the relationship and from a diplomatic level. But on the other hand, the security ties continue and the peace treaty persists. And that's been very important for Israel because Jordan is Israel's longest border and a key strategic partner.
Mm. And what is the nature of his relationship with the Palestinian leadership currently?
So King Abdullah has been a strong supporter of Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah. He's calls for a two-state solution, and including the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And he's done many actions over the years to support the Palestinian president. Abbas meets frequently with King Abdullah, and they have strong ties. But I would say the relationship with Hamas is much more challenging. The Jordanian authorities did not appreciate during the Gaza war how certain Hamas leaders were trying to instigate the Palestinian public in Jordan, because Jordan has about 50% of its population is of Palestinian origin, to join the resistance. Jordan was concerned this would lead to a destabilizing of its own national security. They did not want Jordanian militants to be launching attacks from the Hashemite Kingdom into Israel, because that could lead to Israeli reprisals, similar to what happened after the 1967 war. So the attitudes towards Hamas are much more challenging for the Jordanian government. The Jordanian government also notes that Hamas has strong ties with the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, and the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood is considered an outlawed group in the country, according to a recent ruling by the Jordanian authorities. So they prefer the PA approach, but the Jordanian government is aware that the PA doesn't have significant influence right now.
Do you think that he can somehow leverage both his strategic importance for Israel and the United States, as well as his personal skills as an American, to move ahead with a solution to the Palestinian issue beyond the rhetorical level? As I say, he has been a strong supporter, but that's pretty much where it ended. Can he do something concrete?
So his ability to influence the Israeli government right now is quite limited. King Abdullah hasn't publicly spoken with Netanyahu in over 3 years. He said in a recent interview with the BBC that he doesn't trust a single word Netanyahu says. So all the communication goes on between Israel and Jordan is mainly from the security side, between the IDF and the Jordanian military, or the GID, the Jordanian Intelligence Service, and the Mossad, or the Shin Bet. But in terms of his ability to leverage his relationship with Netanyahu to advance the Palestinian cause, the two leaders don't trust each other. One could maybe argue they despise each other. So therefore, his leverage is quite limited on that front. And that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen any significant advancement on the Palestinian side.
And to do the bidding in America, the Palestinians' bidding?
In terms of with the United States, I would say he uses his leverage on areas that specifically impact Jordanian national interests. So one example would be the Palestinians strongly opposed the relocation of Gazans to Jordan in 2025, and King Abdullah was able to put his foot down because that directly impacted Jordan's population. When in 2017, when President Trump was planning to transfer the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the Jordanian government opposed it. They said it was a red line, but at the end of the day, their leverage is quite limited. And just like Jordan, all these other Arab states, whether Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, they all opposed the transfer of the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. But because it didn't really impact Jordanian national sovereignty or their national security, their ability to leverage the relationship with Washington was limited, and there's no comparison between King Abdullah's stature and Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Mm-hmm. All right, Aaron Magid, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app. And we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and now on Blue Sky as well. But most important, join us again next time for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.